Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi, I'm Oliver.
Hi, I'm Lily.
Science in Easy English.
Is sugar more addictive than drugs?
I have to admit, I had a moment last night that felt a little pathetic.
Uh-oh. What happened?
I was standing in my kitchen, lights off, and I'm just staring at this bag of chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. And I had this full-blown internal debate happening. One half of my brain, like the logical, I want to live past 50 half, was screaming at me. Just eat an apple, it's crisp, it's refreshing, it's sitting right there on the counter.
But these other half.
The part that actually controls my hands, it was just like, no, we are doing this. We are eating the cookies, all of them.
Let me guess which half won that debate.
I mean, the cookies never stood a chance. But it really got me thinking, why is that struggle so incredibly hard? Because I never have to physically restrain myself from eating too much broccoli.
Yeah, nobody is sneaking a second helping of kale when no one is looking.
Exactly. It's this universal struggle. We joke about being chocoholics or having a sugar addiction. But what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive is that for a growing number of neuroscientists, it really isn't a joke.
No, not at all. It's not just a metaphor for really liking sweets.
Right. There is this massive stack of evidence suggesting that what happened in my kitchen last night was an actual biological event, not just a failure of my willpower.
Which I'm sure makes you feel slightly better about the empty cookie bag in your trash can.
A little bit, yeah. But addiction is a really heavy word. Are we seriously comparing a chocolate chip cookie to, I don't know, hard drugs? Because that feels like a massive stretch.
It totally feels like a stretch right up until you look at the raw data.
Yeah.
There was this study we looked at, cited in PLOS ONE and the Current Opinion in Clinical Nutrition, that honestly kept me up at night.
The rat study, right.
Yeah, so researchers took laboratory rats, and keep in mind, these are animals that were already addicted to cocaine.
Which is wild to begin with.
Right, so they are fully chemically dependent on cocaine. And the researchers gave them a choice. They put them in a cage with two levers. One lever gave them a hit of the drug. The other gave them a sip of sweetened water.
So they have to choose between a Class A narcotic and sugar.
Exactly. And the vast majority of them chose the sugar.
Even the ones already hooked on the cocaine.
Yes. Even when the researchers increased the effort required to get the sugar, like they made them work much harder for it, the rats still went for the sweetness over the drug.
That's actually kind of terrifying.
It implies that the reward from sugar, at least in that lab setting, was more powerful than a hard drug. If a rat that's dependent on cocaine is basically saying, actually, I'll take the soda, it completely changes how you look at the vending machine in your office lobby.
It really does. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out why this is happening. Is sugar truly a biological addiction, or is it just a bad habit that we just happen to enjoy a bit too much?
And we're going to look at the brain chemistry, the behavioral evidence, which gets pretty wild, by the way.
It really does.
And also, the fierce debate happening right now in the scientific community about whether food addiction is even a valid medical diagnosis.
Because looking at our source list, we are covering some serious ground today. We've got stuff from the Harvard Gazette, MIT News, the Yale Food Addiction Scale, plus some really deep cuts from the Max Planck Institute and Western Washington University.
Exactly. We're basically going from the neuron all the way to the grocery aisle.
So let's start upstairs, in the brain. If I eat an apple, which naturally has sugar, or a candy bar, which obviously has a ton of added sugar, what is actually happening in my head?
How can a substance found in nature be compared to a drug, right?
Exactly.
It all comes down to the reward system.
Yeah.
Specifically, it's called the mesolimbic dopamine system.
Okay.
When you eat that cookie, your brain releases dopamine. Now, people usually think dopamine is the pleasure chemical, but that's actually a misconception.
Oh, really? I always thought dopamine was just pure pleasure.
Most people do. But dopamine is actually about wanting and motivation. It signals to your brain, hey, this is important, pay attention to this, do this again.
Right, so it's like a survival signal. It's
Right.
what drove our ancestors to find calorie-dense berries so they didn't starve in the winter.
Precisely. But sugar doesn't just trigger dopamine. It also triggers the release of opioids and endorphins in the brain. And those are the chemicals actually associated with liking and genuine pleasure.
So you get the hit of, wow, I really like this.
Followed immediately by the massive dopamine surge of, I need to do this again, right now. According to research we found in brain and behavior, high sugar consumption creates this positive reinforcement mechanism that is just incredibly hard to break.
So your brain basically learns that cookie equals happy and happy equals survival.
Yeah. but it goes even deeper than just learning a habit. We're talking about actual neuroplasticity.
Meaning the brain is changing its physical shape.
Exactly. We pulled a really fascinating source from Cobbers on the brain that discusses something called metabotropic glutamate receptors.
Okay, that is a mouthful. Metabotropic glutamate receptors.
Yeah, let's just call them mGLRs for short.
Good call. What does an mGLR actually do?
Think of these receptors like the volume knobs on a stereo system. When you listen to music at a normal, healthy level, it's fine. Everything sounds great.
Right.
But if you blast the music, like if you flood the brain with highly concentrated sugar, it's way too loud. The brain gets overwhelmed and tries to protect itself. So what does it do? It physically turns the volume knobs down.
It creates a buffer.
Right. It structurally changes its own receptors to become less sensitive. And this is exactly what we call tolerance. The knob is physically stuck on low now. So that one single cookie that used to give you a great buzz, you can't even hear the music anymore.
You need 3 or 4 cookies just to get the volume back to where it used to be.
Exactly.
Man, that explains why the just one rule never ever works for me. My volume knobs are completely broken.
And it also explains the dessert stomach.
Oh, please tell me the dessert stomach is real science. Because I've been using that excuse at Thanksgiving since I was 5 years old.
It actually is real science. The Max Planck Institute released findings on this recently. Usually you have specific nerve cells that signal fullness. They tell your body, okay, stop eating, we have enough energy, we're good.
The signals that somehow vanish when the pie comes out?
Exactly, because the reward signals from sugar are so intensely powerful that they literally override those fullness signals. It's a built-in biological override switch in the brain that makes room for cake, even when you're physically stuffed with turkey.
That is incredibly validating. It's not gluttony, it's just a biological override.
Yeah, but a skeptic might say, surely eating too much cake doesn't look like actual drug addiction in terms of behavior. I mean, nobody is shaking in a corner because they didn't get their gummy bears today.
Well, you say that, but the animal studies suggest something completely different. This is where we get into those Princeton studies we found, led by researchers like Nicole Avena and Bart Hobel.
The ones covered in Frontiers in Psychiatry.
Yes. They didn't just look at whether rats liked the sugar. They looked at what happened when they forcibly took it away.
The withdrawal phase.
Exactly. They set up this system where rats had intermittent access to sugar, so they weren't just eating it 24/7. They had access for 12 hours and then no access for 12 hours.
Which honestly sounds exactly like human dieting. We eat super clean all day, and then we binge on the couch at night. Or we're perfect all week and go crazy on the weekend.
Exactly. It perfectly mimics human binging behavior. And when they took the sugar away completely, or if they blocked the receptors with an opioid antagonist like naloxone, the rats went into full-blown physical withdrawal.
What does a rat in sugar withdrawal actually look like?
It's pretty disturbing to read about. We're talking teeth chattering, tremors, severe anxiety, head shakes. They exhibited the exact same physical symptoms you'd see in an animal withdrawing from morphine or nicotine.
Teeth chattering. From sugar.
Yeah. Their brain chemistry had been altered so significantly that the sudden absence of the sugar caused a literal physical crisis.
That's intense. I always thought a sugar crash just meant getting a little sleepy in the afternoon.
Yeah.
I had no idea it could manifest as physical tremors.
It just shows how deep the dependency goes. But there's another finding from these Princeton studies that I found even more frightening. It's a concept called cross-sensitization.
Cross-sensitization. That sounds a lot like a gateway drug theory.
That is essentially exactly what it is. The research showed that rats with a history of high sugar intake had a significantly heightened response to other drugs later on, like amphetamines and alcohol.
Wait, so you're saying that eating a high-sugar diet made them more susceptible to other addictions?
Yes. Because those reward pathways, those volume knobs we talked about, they were already primed and sensitized. The sugar preloaded the gun, so to speak.
Wow.
It implies that a high-sugar diet early on might actually make the brain more vulnerable to other forms of chemical dependency later in life.
That is a massive implication, especially when you think about what kids are eating every single day.
Yeah.
You might literally be priming their brains for addiction before they're even old enough to vote.
It's definitely a sobering thought.
But okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Those are rats. And rats are great biological models, but they aren't people. I don't chatter my teeth if I skip dessert. Is there evidence that humans actually fit this clinical model?
Maybe we aren't physically chattering our teeth in the break room, but let's look at the behavior. We have the Yale Food Addiction Scale, the YFAS, And this was specifically designed to map eating behaviors directly onto the DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorder.
Right, and the DSM-5 is basically the Bible for diagnosing mental disorders.
Yeah.
So we're checking to see if our eating patterns match the clinical definition of an addiction. What are the specific criteria?
There are quite a few, but let's look at the ones from the Robert Lustig source and the YFAS validation studies. One of the main ones is hazardous use.
Hazardous use, like eating a sandwich while skydiving.
More like eating a burger while driving. We all know distracted driving is incredibly dangerous, yet how many people are trying to navigate a burger, fries, and a shake while merging onto a busy highway?
Guilty.
Right. Or think about use despite knowledge of harm. That's a really big one.
Like the smoker who just keeps smoking even after they get an emphysema diagnosis.
Exactly that. If you have type 2 diabetes or severe heart disease, you know logically that sugar is hurting you. Your doctor has told you it is physically damaging your body. But if you find yourself completely unable to stop eating it, that fits the exact clinical criteria for addiction. You are using the substance despite knowing it's causing you bodily harm.
That's a really tough one because you see that happening all the time. People who are literally losing their health or even limbs to metabolic disease, but they just cannot put the soda down.
Then there's social impairment. Avoiding social events because you'd rather stay home and binge alone, or because you're ashamed of how much you're eating.
Or hiding food wrappers from your partner.
Exactly. And another one is failure to fulfill obligations. Feeling so sluggish from a massive sugar crash that you can't play with your kids, or you're totally unproductive at your job.
I think literally everyone has felt that post-lunch slump where you just stare blankly at your computer screen and your brain is just totally offline.
Right, but for some people, it's a chronic daily state. However, this is where the debate in the scientific community gets really heated. We have sources like the Harvard Gazette, where Dr. Frank Hughes strongly argues that sugar is not an addictive substance in the clinical sense.
Interesting. And what is his argument? Because honestly, the rat studies and the DSM criteria seem pretty convincing.
His main point boils down to biological necessity. We absolutely need food to survive. You can't just go cold turkey on eating. You can live the rest of your life without alcohol. You can live without tobacco. But you cannot live without food.
Right.
So he argues that labeling an ingredient in our food as addictive blurs the lines way too much. He says it pathologizes a basic survival instinct.
I mean, that makes total sense. We have to eat to live. You can't just completely abstain from calories.
True. But Dr. Robert Lustig, a pediatric endocrinologist who is very vocal on this topic, completely counters that argument. He says we have to make a hard distinction between food, which is a substrate for growth and burning energy, and food additives.
Okay, so how does he define the difference between a food and an additive?
He points directly to the biology of fructose. This is the sweet molecule in table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. He argues that while glucose, which is the basic energy of life found in things like bread or potatoes, suppresses the hunger hormone ghrelin, fructose does not.
Break that down for me a bit. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think of glucose as a very polite dinner guest. It knocks on the door, enters your bloodstream, and immediately tells your brain, hey, I'm here, we have energy, you can stop eating now. Your brain gets the message and successfully turns off the hunger signals.
Okay. And fructose?
Fructose is like a stealth bomber. It completely slips past the body's radar. You can easily eat 500 calories of pure fructose, but because it doesn't trigger that ghrelin suppression, your brain's fullness sensor never actually goes off. You are literally ghosting your own appetite.
Wow. That perfectly explains why you can drink a massive 32-ounce soda and still be physically hungry 5 minutes later.
Exactly. Lustig argues that because fructose offers absolutely no nutritional value, doesn't signal fullness, and actively drives compulsive use, it behaves much more like a drug or an artificial food additive than an actual nutrient.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. It's not food addiction, it's additive addiction.
Right. And that leads us seamlessly into the psychological side of things. Why do we crave this stuff so badly when we're stressed out? We found a study from the University of Karachi, which was referenced in the North Hennepin Community College source, that explains this anxiety loop.
Ah, the emotional eating connection.
Yes. Sugar temporarily spikes serotonin, the happy chemical in your brain, and simultaneously reduces cortisol, which is your main stress hormone. So in the short term, it absolutely works. It acts as a literal chemical anxiety antidote.
But I'm assuming there's a catch.
A huge catch. The study showed that long-term, high-sugar diets actually depleted serotonin and tryptophan levels in the subjects. So over time, eating a lot of sugar makes you more anxious and more depressed.
which then makes you crave even more sugar to fix the anxiety that the sugar originally caused.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle of self-medication where the medicine is actively making the underlying disease worse.
And that leads right into the concept of food noise. This is a term from our source on GLP-1s and addiction care. It describes that constant intrusive thought process about food.
Food noise. I really love that term. What does it actually feel like for someone experiencing it?
It's like having a radio left on in the background of your mind that you just can't turn off. You're sitting there trying to work, but a part of your brain is constantly whispering, is there cake in the break room? I really shouldn't eat the cake. Maybe just a tiny piece. No, I'll be good today. But it's chocolate.
Oh, that is painfully relatable. It's the total inability to focus on your actual life because your brain is obsessing over securing the next reward.
Exactly. And that brings us to the environmental factor, because it's not just about our individual brains. It's about what we are constantly surrounded by. We need to talk about UPFs, or ultra-processed foods.
Right. The Frontiers source had a really interesting comparison for this. They literally compared UPFs to cigarettes.
They did. The core argument is that highly processed foods are essentially engineered delivery vehicles. Just as a modern cigarette is scientifically designed to deliver nicotine as efficiently as possible to the lungs, a store-bought cookie or a potato chip is engineered with very specific ratios of sugar, fat, and salt.
The bliss point.
Right, the bliss point. It's calculated to perfectly override the brain's natural stop signals.
So it's not just that strawberries are sweet and we like sweet things. It's that this processed snack bar is scientifically designed in a lab to be the perfect storm of reward signals.
Yes, but there's a ray of hope here, and it comes from the Western Washington University source regarding something called environmental enrichment. This is often referred to as the rat park experiment.
Oh, I've heard of this. It's the study with the toys, right?
Yes. In the standard, older experiments, rats were kept in these small, solitary, boring cages with absolutely nothing to do but press the lever for drugs or sugar. But when researchers put the rats in Rat Park, which was this nice, huge cage with tunnels, running wheels, toys, and plenty of other rats to socialize with, something amazing happened.
They stopped caring about the drugs.
Significantly so, yes. They were much less interested in the sugar water and the drugs compared to the isolated rats.
That is fascinating. So sheer boredom and social isolation were driving the addiction just as much as the actual chemical hook.
Exactly. Addiction isn't just a chemical problem, it's an environmental one. If your life is rich with other natural sources of dopamine, like social connection, engaging hobbies, or just having fun, the pull of the sugar naturally weakens. The volume knob doesn't have to be turned up so artificially high because you're getting great music from other places in your life.
That's a huge takeaway for anyone listening. It means we can't just hyper-focus on the food itself. We have to look at the life we're living while we eat it. But let's say someone is listening to this deep dive right now and realizing, okay, I think I actually have a problem with sugar. What happens when you try to quit? Because if it's a real addiction, there has to be real withdrawal.
And there absolutely is. According to the sources from Addiction Help and the American Council on Science and Health, the withdrawal symptoms in humans are very real. Headaches are the most common complaint, but people also experience severe brain fog, irritability, mood swings, and deep fatigue.
The dreaded keto flu or the classic sugar crash.
Exactly. It's a very real physical response to sudden dopamine depletion. Your brain is basically shouting, hey, where's my happy chemical?
So based on this huge stack of sources we've gone through, what are the actionable strategies here? How do you break the cycle without being completely miserable for weeks?
We found 3 really solid strategies in the literature. The first tip comes from UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, and it's simple. Fiber.
Fiber. Okay, it's not exactly the sexiest solution, but walk me through the mechanism. Why fiber?
Think of fiber like a speed bump in your gut. If you eat a whole apple, the natural fiber makes the sugar hit your bloodstream slowly, kind of like a gentle stream. But if you drink a glass of apple juice, which has had all the fiber stripped out, it's like a fire hose of pure glucose.
Right.
That fiber prevents the violent insulin spikes and subsequent crashes that drive those intense cravings. It keeps your blood sugar stable, which in turn keeps your brain a lot quieter.
That makes total sense. It turns a massive flood into a manageable trickle. What's the second strategy?
The second tip comes from Harvard, and it's really crucial. Do not go cold turkey.
Really? But if it's an addiction, shouldn't you just completely cut it off? Just tear the Band-Aid off?
You'd think so, but Dr. Hughes suggests that because sugar is literally omnipresent in our environment, And because the withdrawal can be so psychologically taxing, going cold turkey very often backfires. It leads to the what the hell effect,
Hmm.
where you slip up once, have one candy bar, and then just binge because you feel like you failed.
Ah, right.
Gradual reduction is better because it allows the brain's receptors, those volume knobs, to upregulate slowly. You want to sensitize them again without sending the brain into full crisis mode.
So you're slowly retraining the brain. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And the third tip ties right back to the rat park study we discussed. Fix the boredom. Find a hobby.
Environmental enrichment for humans.
Yes. The Western Washington study proved that your environment matters immensely. If you're eating purely because you're bored or lonely, no amount of sheer willpower is going to fix that long term. You need to actively fill that void with something else that provides genuine satisfaction.
Mhm.
Knit, go for a run, play video games, call a friend. You need to find a dopamine source that isn't edible.
That is surprisingly holistic advice for a deep dive on neuroscience. It's not just about eat this, don't eat that. It's about fixing your environment.
It really is.
So to summarize where we are right now, sugar appears to hijack the exact same reward pathways in the brain as cocaine. It creates physical tolerance, meaning you need more to get the same hit. It creates real withdrawal symptoms when you stop, and it is heavily engineered into our modern food supply in a way that makes it incredibly hard to avoid.
And while the scientific community is still actively arguing over whether to officially label it an addiction in the medical diagnostic books, the underlying biological mechanisms, the dopamine surges, the receptor changes, the fructose stealth bomber effect, those are simply undeniable facts.
They really are.
Yeah.
Whether you want to call it a full-blown addiction or just a very strong, heavily engineered habit, the physical effect on your brain is profound.
It really makes you rethink your next trip to the grocery store. You're not just buying calories, you're buying chemistry.
You absolutely are. And I want to leave everyone listening with one final thought from the Robert Lustig source that I've been mulling over ever since I read it.
Let's hear it.
We generally accept that we need to regulate drugs like alcohol and tobacco. We have strict age limits, we have heavy taxes, we have designated areas for sale. We do all of this because we recognize they are additives that fundamentally alter our physiology.
Right.
Now, if added sugar is technically a food additive that offers zero nutritional value, and remember, fructose doesn't even suppress hunger, but it actively drives compulsive use and leads to chronic disease across the population, should we be regulating the grocery store candy aisle the exact same way we regulate the liquor store?
Wow. That would change absolutely everything about how we eat and shop. Just imagine getting carded for trying to buy a Snickers bar.
It sounds totally absurd right now, but biologically speaking, it might not be that far off the mark. It's definitely something to chew on, preferably while eating something very high in fiber.
Absolutely no naked carbs allowed.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.